Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Julie Kline from the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. I'm sure we'll have a few more people joining us, but let's get started. Very pleased today to have this conversation about Haiti. Let me first introduce Doug Savage, Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM.
Well, thank you, Julie, and thank you everyone for taking time on a steamy afternoon. Hopefully we'll conclude our proceedings before the next round of torrential rain comes through, but we are here today to have a conversation with Patrick Bellegarde-Smith about his native Haiti. He is, as many of you know, Professor Emeritus at UWM, where his work focused on Caribbean cultures, politics, and history. Beyond UWM, he is recipient of the State University of Haiti's Jean Price Mars Medal and a Lifetime Achievement Award for Scholarship from the Haitian Studies Association, of which he is also a former president. He's also associate editor of the Journal of Haitian Studies. And in addition to his scholarly work, you Patrick, I know have a familial connection to U.S.-Haitian relations in that your grandfather was Haiti's ambassador to the U.S.
On several occasions.
Very good. Well, and you also serve as president of the Congress of Santa Barbara, Scholarly Association for the Study of Voodoo and other African-derived religions, and are a recognized priest of Haitian Voodoo. So I cannot imagine someone with whom we could have this conversation who would be more qualified and I'm sure more penetrating and insightful. So with that, let's just get underway. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about first the events of July 7th and the assassination of President Moise and kind of the official account of it involving sort of a Jean Le Carré cast of characters of Colombian mercenaries and Cuban expats living in Florida and all kinds of things. So talk a little bit about sort of what the official story is and how credible you find that.
Well, the situation is still very, very murky. We don't have the results of any of the investigations that were started already. And my fear is that we may never know, never reach the bottom of it. And it all depends, of course, on who was involved and how significant they are and how financially powerful they are in Haiti and abroad. And so we may never get to the bottom of it. The few other presidents who were assassinated, we pretty much know who was involved and why. But in this particular case, one is unsure as of this moment. The fact of the matter is that President Moise was highly contested. He had very little support in the country. In fact, nobody liked him except for President Trump and President Biden. But he had no support in the country itself. And in fact, about 18% of the electorate went out to vote in that election that where he emerged as president with 39% of the votes of 18%. People stayed home. They did not like the choices that were given. And so this is a perfect arrangement for those who might want to control the president because he has no popular support.
Well, talk a little bit, if you would, about just who he is as a candidate and where did he come from?
Well, he came from northern Haiti. He had a plantation, a banana plantation, and his support came from the Americans mostly, and certain sectors of the Haitian upper class. But otherwise, he was not very well known and dubious in terms of his financial arrangements. And he was accused of corruption, but other presidents right before him were as well. So that's nothing new in this regard. But he managed to come out on the top, as I said, about 18% of the electoral voting. And it's also significant for me that The number of people voting, the percentage of the electorate voting over long periods of time has been decreasing from the time Aristide was voted on overwhelmingly by the Haitian population. At every election thereafter, there were fewer and fewer people wanting to vote because they did not like the choices that were given. And so, so we went from about 60% all the way to 18% in terms of the last presidential election.
So one of well, there are several, as you allude to, controversies, one being the fate of the legislature. So what's going on there?
Well, he refused to call elections. And in terms of the Haitian Senate, it's a staggered election. And so there were, at the time of his assassination, only 10 senators out of 30 who were still in power, as it were. And part of it is that he wanted to amend the Constitution or change the Constitution altogether, which would have given him absolute power. Not only did he attack the legislature, the parliament, and wanted to see his way to institute a unicameral legislature, as François Duvalier had done back in the 60s, but also he had attacked the Haitian Supreme Court. He had fired some judges of the Supreme Court. And so one saw where he was heading, and people took to the streets as a result of all this. And he was under no rush, actually, to leave power. And as I said before, both the Trump administration and the Biden administration supported him in power.
So there was some question about when his term actually ended, because the election had been delayed, right? The election that brought him to power. And so if, and correct me if I'm wrong, the controversy was the term for many people ended when it would have predictably and traditionally ended, but his take on it was, no, actually the clock didn't start running until I was elected after the delay, so I've got more time left.
Well, this is what he said, and Aristide had tried to argue the same point, and it was rejected by the United States. And so, and if he had done well, if Moïse had done well, people might have listened to that argument, but they wanted him out even before the end of his term. So that argument held no water for the Haitian public.
So let's broaden it out a bit and talk a little bit about the enduring effects of the 2010 earthquake and really how that still impacts the lives of so many Haitians.
Well, the world had said that it would contribute billions of dollars for reconstruction. That has not really happened. Those billions, for the most part, never materialized. About 1% of it was given to the Haitian government because mostly the United States wanted to give that money to the 10,000 NGOs that operate in Haiti, which is known as the Republic of NGOs, which means what? That the intent was to weaken the government as much as possibly could happen. And this, by the way, was what was attempted back in 1915 all the way to the present, where foreign powers that have intervened in Haiti have always wanted to see a very, very weak government in that country. And so the money never materialized, things were not built. Even the American Red Cross was rife with scandal in terms of the housing they actually built. I think it was 6 houses that must have cost hundreds of thousands each, and not much happened afterwards. So the money, for the most part, never materialized. And a lot of it was actually given to American companies working around Washington, D.C., who were friends of Hillary Clinton. And so that was part of the scandal as well. And she's hated in the country and remains a hateful figure there.
Well, let's take a step back and look at some of that history, because I think it so impacts what's going on today. But before we do that, I would like to invite our participants to type any questions you might have into the chat at the bottom of your screen, and we can include that as part of the conversation. But so let's go all the way back, I guess. Well, not all the way back, but to 1697, when France and Spain were at war. They ultimately settled their differences, at least temporarily, by dividing the island of Hispaniola. So talk a little bit about that immediate period for what was then Saint-Domingue rather than Haiti.
Well, Saint-Domingue was the most successful colony in the world. Since in terms of monies that were produced, capital that was actually formed for France that allowed France to industrialize rather rapidly and become one of the two world powers at that time. And of course, that work was produced by an enormous number of enslaved Africans that were brought in by France, whose life expectancy was about 7 years after they were captured and brought to the colony of Saint-Domingue. And so when the struggle for independence took place, the majority of Haitians were not born in the colony of Saint-Domingue, but they were born in West and Central Africa. And so they had memories of freedom, which native-born enslaved Africans in the colony might not have had, even though the leadership were Creoles that were born in the colony itself. But it was far more significant, Saint-Domingue, than the 13 colonies of the United States. And it sort of reminds me, I'm reminded that when France lost to England and lost Canada, they begged to retain Martinique and Guadeloupe in the Eastern Caribbean because those were far more valuable than all of Canada. Port-au-Prince at one point was far more populous than New York City. So we're talking about a very prosperous colony, but of course, enslaved African had absolutely nothing. And the French never built anything. They didn't build schools. They didn't even build churches, what the Spanish and the Portuguese have done here. And so we have not much left from the colonial period in terms of physical plant. But it was, and obviously, what occurs thereafter is that in order to ensure recognition from other foreign powers, France obligated Haiti, the Haitian government, to pay 150 million francs to the former slave owners. And it took 127 years for Haiti to pay that debt. 80% of all national revenues for a century went to the repayment of that debt. Therefore, there was nothing left for infrastructure, nothing left for schools. And so we have what we have now as a result of all that.
And just as a concept, it's rather interesting to think that the former enslaved people owed reparations to the former enslavers.
Well, Haitians are trying to get $21 billion from the French. That will never happen, of course. And the very same efforts are being made in the Anglophone Caribbean, the countries of the Eastern Caribbean, from Jamaica all the way to Barbados and Guyana, for reparations from the part of the British. But that will never happen either, or the Americans for that matter here in the United States. This is not the way the world works. Oh yes, they had to pay twice, and hence Haiti was unable to develop.
Well, and in fact, it had an impact on just the nature of agriculture on the island, did it not? I mean, there was a move towards cash crops rather than the kinds of crops that had fed the people for millennia because they needed to raise money.
Oh, yes. So the government went full force in terms of, to the extent that it could, reestablish a plantation. And that was not very successful. But indeed, cash crop had to be raised in order to pay for the reparations that were owed to the former slave owners. It bears, one needs to know also that between 1804, January 1st, independence, to about 1860 or so, the Haitian peasantry had the highest standard of living in Latin America because they were planting and eating. There was not much going on in terms of commerce, but the country was certainly self-sufficient in terms of food production. And they had the highest standard of living in this hemisphere outside the United States itself. This is not the case, of course, now.
Right, right. Well, you know, one can imagine the reaction that the independence received on the part of other slaveholding powers in the region. So independence is not recognized and withheld for quite some time. So talk a little bit about when the US, for example, finally recognized the Haitian government.
Well, we had to wait, of course, for Abraham Lincoln to do so in 1862. And he recognized both Haiti and Liberia at the same time. There was some commerce going on, but it was mostly illegal commerce that was taking place between the United States and Haiti. And it's also interesting that, for instance, when the Latin American states, which Haiti helped become independent, because Haitians were funneling weapons to the South American insurgents against Spain. When these countries invited Haiti to the first Pan American conference in Panama, the US objected, and the invitation to Haiti was rescinded by the South American governments. So Haiti was feared by the European powers at that time, and I include the United States in that category, because of the insurgency had to be put down, and since it wasn't, it was feared for all kinds of reasons, and rightly so. So Haiti punched above its weight for a number of decades in the 19th century. And so it had to be punished in the very same way, for very much the same reason that Cuba is being punished now, very much for the same reasons. Those are bad examples.
Well, fast forward a bit, and we've got 1915 when there was another presidential assassination. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, the president was assassinated by members of the Haitian elite because he had ordered the killing of 127, I think, members of that elite, young men who were protesting his government. The US had actually made plans to invade Haiti way before that. And in the documentation, the actual paper, the date was left in blank. And so they just added the date at the very last moment because the invasion had been intended. Before the 1915 invasion, the US had intervened militarily 19 times already. And the president who was killed was also the president at the behest of the United States. So since 1915, you cannot survive, you cannot stay in the presidency or get elected in the first place unless you have the blessings of Washington. Cannot happen otherwise.
Well, which is a fact that was not lost on some Americans here. And I'll read a bit of an extended passage from the Nation magazine from August 28th of 1920. And the author is James Weldon Johnson, leader of the NAACP at the time. And he says, to know the reason for the present political situation in Haiti, to understand why the United States landed and has for 5 years maintained military forces in that country, why some 3,000 Haitian men, women, and children have been shot down by American rifles and machine guns, it is necessary, among other things, to know that the National City Bank of New York is very much interested in Haiti. It is necessary to know that the National City Bank controls the National Bank of Haiti and the depository for all of the Haitian national funds that are being collected by American officials, and that Mr. R.L. Farnham, Vice President of the National City Bank, is virtually the representative of the State Department in matters relating to the island republic.
And of course, Haiti was not unique in all this because Central America as well, the Dominican Republic had been invaded a year later in 1916, and the US remained in the Dominican Republic until 1924. And the Dominicans refused to collaborate with the Americans, so they had a military government imposed upon them. Many Haitians collaborated with the invasion, And so we had at least a figurehead president and a cabinet that did as well as it could under the circumstances. In fact, my grandfather was part of that cabinet under the US occupation. But it's certain that the US had plans far ahead of the invasion itself. And one of the things that the US did immediately upon descending upon Haiti is to change the Haitian constitution. And since 1805, it was forbidden for foreigners to own land in Haiti. All land had been nationalized after independence in 1804 and then redistributed in the first Latin American agrarian reform soon thereafter. Land was given to peasants and to people of significance in the Haitian army at that point. And so the US changed that provision, allowing Americans to own land in Haiti, something that Haitians have never been comfortable with, obviously, for good reasons. And we know what that brings. And the US also did its best to tarnish the reputation of the Haitian Supreme Court. That's one of the institutions that went after, for some reason, was the Haitian Supreme Court that was highly respected at that time. And I don't know that the court has ever regained its standing since then, actually. And there were a number of other provisions. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was in the Department of the Navy at that time, says that he wrote the Haitian Constitution all by himself on a train ride between New York City and Washington, D.C. I don't know if he was exaggerating or not, but that's what he claims.
So talk a little bit about some of the other sort of abrogations of human rights and civil rights that the average Haitian had to endure in that period.
Well, there was a concentration camp established there. A Haitian geographer, whom I knew quite well, who died during the earthquake of 2010, in some of his work has revealed that based on statistical evidence that about 55,000 Haitians were essentially killed by the US Marine because there was immediately guerrilla activity that took place in the country protesting the US invasion. And so people were being killed, people were being imprisoned, newspapermen were arrested, newspapers were disbanded, the legislature was disbanded. The first time we ever had a referendum in the country is when the Marine Corps led Haitian peasants under armed guard to vote the new constitution imposed by the US, and that constitution resulted in 99-point-something% approval rate. And so the referendum were introduced by the US to Haiti, and dictatorships since then have tried to use the referendum as a tool for their own power, rather successfully, because Duvalier did that on several occasions himself, for instance. But we have had a succession of conservative governments. It's what I would call Duvalierism without Duvalier. Because the Constitution of 1987, for instance, forbade Duvalierists, who were well known and part of the dictatorship for all those years in Haiti, for those decades, to run for office for 10 years. Of course, the 10 years have elapsed and they are back. Because the succession of presidents we have had in Haiti, except for Aristide, of course, who was removed by the United States twice, these are Duvalier folks, and that's the right wing in Haiti, which has no popular support, but it manages to stay in power.
So, whereas in this, the period of the 1915 invasion, I think one could argue it was not ideological in any way. I mean, it was just basic sort of mercantilism. A little later on, part of what animated that relationship, and I'd like your opinion on this, was the inevitable drawing of sides between the US and the Soviet Union. So part of what made the Duvalier attractive beginning in 1957 was just an avowedly anti-communist stand. Would you say that's yes. Accurate?
Oh, yes, even though the Duvalierists, when money failed to come at a more rapid rate, they did put the US warned the US that they are looking at the Soviet Union because if money doesn't come fast enough, we will turn away from the US. They did make that threat to the US. When it came for the US to get rid of Cuba at the Organization of American States in Punta del Este in Uruguay, for instance, the Secretary of State of the US had to pay the Foreign Minister of Haiti $7 million to ensure to have the Haitian vote. And that was the crucial vote that the US needed to kick Cuba out of the OAS. But that money, the 7 million, was put to good use because it developed the international airport that we have in Port-au-Prince that we're using today. So that money served a good purpose, I guess.
Well, that era of the Duvaliers was particularly infamous. So talk a little bit about what life was like in that era for the average Haitian.
Well, it's really interesting because I lived that period of time. I was in the country till I left in 1964, and I discovered fairly recently that I was suffering from PTSD and never knew it. As a result of all this, the fear was intense. One could not speak openly, even in family settings, for fear, for instance, that children would start blabbing in school and would be reported. We had, for instance, in my family, the chauffeur, since no one in my family ever knew how to drive for the past many generations, we had a chauffeur, and he was a spy. He was a Tonton Macoute, a henchman of Duvalier, and was spying on the family. The Mexican ambassador and his Danish wife in Port-au-Prince were also paid by the Duvalier regime to spy on my grandfather. And I took a picture of them actually in the living room when he visited once a month, but he was reporting to the Haitian government as well. So even foreign representatives in Port-au-Prince were not immune to being paid assets of the Duvalier regime. And so the secret police was rather effective and did their job rather well. And tens of thousands of Haitians were murdered, many of whom were very well-known personalities, but others were people that nobody had ever heard of and whose names were never recorded, of course. But there was strong opposition to Duvalier himself, but he was the darling of the United States, so no one could touch him. And when there were invasions coming in from abroad to try to overthrow him, the Marine Corps went to fight in the countryside in Haiti to get rid of those invaders, not the Haitian army.
So Francois manages to pass the mantle on to his son. And
there were US warships within sight of Port-au-Prince in order to make sure that the transition would be peaceful.
And so life continued much as it had under the next generation?
Yeah, there were some improvements because he said he was going to do the economic revolution because his father had done the political revolution, which meant that the opposition had been killed, had been decimated. And it's fascinating in terms of the way it happens. At one point, for instance, I do remember that we were out of school for the better part of a year. We could not go out. It was dangerous to go out at that point. At one point, for instance, the students, high school and university students went on strike, and they were accused of being communists. So the US immediately backed the Haitian government as a result of this. There was also, of course, a weak Haitian Communist Party. And the US Embassy gave the name of these people to the Haitian government, said, they are meeting next week in this house, in this neighborhood, go get them. They were all assassinated. The Central Committee of the Haitian Communist Party were all killed, every last one of them, and on the instruction of the US Embassy. And so the very weak Haitian Communist Party ceased to exist, essentially. And now it's really interesting that many years later, when Aristide came to power, George H.W. Bush, who had, of course, been the head of the CIA, favored as prime minister the head of the Haitian Communist Party, Theodore. And, and one wonders why that President Bush would want the head of the Communist Party as Prime Minister of Haiti under Aristide. Aristide said no and was able to not install that man as his Prime Minister. And so it becomes very murky. We don't know what's really going on, although the Haitians have a better idea than Americans will ever know.
So after 2 generations of Duvaliers in 1990, there's a democratically elected new president. And talk a little bit about what made that process possible.
Well, President Aristide was elected overwhelmingly, did not even have to have a second turn because he won outright in every department in the country. And he was overthrown within 7 months. Again, at the urging of the United States, he was talking about raising the minimum wage, and American companies in Haiti said, absolutely not. We're not raising the minimum wage. 7 months later, he was out of power. In fact, his life was saved by the French ambassador who took him under his wing. But then again, François Mitterrand, the socialist president in France, was president then, and Mitterrand and Aristide had something in common. And of course, as you know, he was returned by Clinton and removed again by Baby Bush. So the Papa Bush and Baby Bush, and was removed again the second time around, flown out of the country, sent not to Jamaica, which is the favorite place for Haitian exiles, but sent to the Central African Republic, and of course ended up in the Republic of South Africa after a spell, but was returned by the Clinton after Aristide had signed everything that Clinton wanted to sign. At first, Aristide, in terms of the first and second period of time, ended up in Caracas, Venezuela. He ended up in Washington, D.C., because he feared assassination by the Americans in Venezuela. And so came to the US because he knew he would be safe here, because the US had been stung by the assassination of Orlando Letelier, cabinet minister under Allende, who was murdered in the streets of Washington with Miss Muffet, his assistant. I went to that funeral in Washington. And so we were not going to assassinate a foreign leader in the streets of Washington because it had happened once before, and that was not a good thing. But Aristide did several good things at the very, very end of his administration. He sent the Haitian army packing. So we have no army, which is a very good thing, because the army was a police force. And as it turns out, according to the New York Times, every single general in the Haitian army had been a paid asset of the US CIA since they were second lieutenant all the way to becoming generals. Every one of them was receiving a check from the CIA every single month, according to the New York Times. And so no more Haitian army. And he also, at the eve of his departure and handing power over to Préval, President Préval, he recognized Cuba. And the US, Clinton was enraged by the fact that Haiti had just recognized Cuba. And the Haitians and the Cubans have always been very close for 200 years. Some of the Cuban freedom fighters were in exile in Haiti, for instance. They established the shoe industry in Port-au-Prince. My grandfather learned Spanish because of those Haitian exiles. Jose Marti visited Haiti, for instance, and that kind of thing. So those countries have been exceedingly close and have always been so. So there was the recognition of Cuba, and there was the disbanding of the Haitian army. And those are the two good things that occurred at the very end in order to save that trouble to the incoming administration of President Préval.
So talk a little bit, if you would, about the expat community in the US. I mean, we can broadly make certain assumptions, perhaps inaccurately and crudely, but you know, within very broad terms about sort of the traditional older generation of Cuban expats in South Florida about, just politically what their stand tends to be, and based on their experience. Is there broad generalities that can be made for Haiti's expat community in the U.S.?
Well, there are about 2 million Haitians in exile who still remain very close to the country for all intents and purposes, in terms of economic terms, as well as political terms. The U.S. has quite a few Haitians in places like New York City and Miami and Boston and Washington, D.C. But it's interesting that these folks are divided in terms of social class, and the more educated professional Haitians ended up in places like Montreal. And in Montreal, I think there are about 160,000 Haitians living there. Some of them have been done very, very well indeed. The head of the Liberal Party in Quebec, in the province of Quebec, is a Haitian woman, for instance. A Governor General of Canada was a Haitian woman as well, named by the Queen of England, as it were. And you have about 100,000 Haitians living in Paris, in France. And in Dominican Republic, it's close to 1 million, actually. And so Haitians are everywhere, and they've been very, very helpful. And it is said, for instance, that between 70 and 80% of Haitian professionals have fled Haiti and live abroad, which is not a very good thing, because they were trained in Haitian schools at Haitian universities and ended up in the US working their, living their professional lives. There are more Haitian physicians, more Haitian medical doctors in Canada than there are in Haiti, for instance. And many of these people have ended up in Canadian politics and done quite well for themselves. And so there was an effort by some of these individuals to return to Haiti after the election of President Aristide, but it did not succeed very well because of the events that subsequently occurred in the country. But I had plans to go back home during that time as well. And in fact, I tried to make an appointment. I met Aristide several times, and I tried to see him as soon as he was, when he became president, but he was busy organizing his cabinet and could not see me, and I had to return to UWM to teach my classes. And so I could not linger and wait for him to call me to the palace at that time. And so we have a very large, but the Haitian migrants in the US certainly do not have the power that the Cubans have in the US. Certainly we're not concentrated in one state. And most of the Haitian migrants here are not members of the upper class or the upper middle class as the Cubans were. Many of the Cubans were at first. And so we do not have that kind of power within American politics.
So, we've kind of come full circle historically here. So talk a little bit about just what's the situation right now then? I mean, investigations are ongoing. There's some talk that the ringleader was in fact an expat living in Miami. So, where does that stand right now?
As I said before, it's very murky. One doesn't know. The assassination. There were 3 perimeters, security perimeters for the president. All 3 perimeters were breached. And one thing that came to me immediately is that we have recording in the streets at 1 in the morning when these folks arrive saying, "We are DEA, we are DEA." And there is a DEA station in Port-au-Prince because it is one of the turning plates for the drug trade coming to the US. It's been for quite a while now. and members of the government were involved in that, it appears. And so when the bodyguards must have heard this is DEA, they decided not to interfere. In fact, they were not DEA. And so they were able to breach 3 different parameters and get to the president, and apparently tortured him before killing him, which is kind of interesting. Some people say that members of the Haitian oligarchy were responsible for that murder. Could very well be. We now have about, I'm told, 600 millionaires and some billionaires in Haiti. The poorer the country, the more people get rich, apparently. And when I was a child, there was only one millionaire, only one. And I played with the children he had with his mistress. Those were my playmates at that time. Now there are 600 of them. And so those are very powerful members of the elite, the establishment. And they may have chosen to get rid of him. I do not know. And we may never know, actually, because these people have a lot of clout in the country.
Well, we've got a question from one of our audience members who's basically asking what the U.S. gets out of Haiti at this point. I mean, there's no longer the sort of Cold War ideological concerns. So what? And we heard what the interests were in the early part of the 20th century with the Bank of New York. And so where do things stand now? What is the U.S. stake in this game?
Well, even minor U.S. companies doing work in Haiti have a lot of power, and have the ear of the American government. After all, Calvin Coolidge, when he was president, said, "America's business is business." And so that remains a factor. And the other thing also, which is kind of interesting and counterproductive in terms of what the U.S. has done, is that we're afraid of both people. We do not want them to come here. They're not Cubans after all, so they're not welcome here. Part of it is racial, obviously, but it's counterproductive. What I think the U.S. needs to do is to leave Haiti alone. And I'm reminded of what John Paul II said when he visited Africa, and that was stunning that he had that realization. When left alone, Africa works. But of course, nobody's ever left Africa alone, and Haiti has never been left alone either. Just leave the Haitians to their own devices, and they might just resolve those issues. And those issues are a matter of social class, it's a matter of color. Colorism is a significant issue in the country. A very small elite that has all the power and all the economic resources, and who look down upon the majority of Haitians. So it's best to leave it alone and see what happens next. They were able to do quite well after 1804, and one could see where that could happen again.
And so, what are the structural impediments to that happening? I mean, we've seen, in the history that obviously outside powers have long designed the system to make it almost inevitable that as an economy and as a society, it was very difficult for Haitians to.
The objective was always to weaken the Haitian government. For instance, the 10,000 or so NGOs that operate in Haiti, which is second only to the NGOs operating in India, that are about the same numbers, do not file any paperwork with the Haitian government. They are told they have to do so legally. They absolutely refuse to do so, and they operate freely in the country without interference from the Haitian government. The institutions have been weakened, not only by foreign powers, but also by Haitian presidents who want to retain in power. And the reaction of weak governments is to have violence. And that's the only way to respond, because there is nothing else they can respond with. So a violent government is a sign of weakness rather than power. And in Haiti, we have seen that over and over again in terms of the dictatorships that have taken hold there. And it's, if the Haitian army had existed President Moise would not have been assassinated because it would have taken one phone call at 12 midnight from the US Embassy in Port-au-Prince telling the president you are leaving at 6 in the morning. And he would say yes. That's the way it happened with Jean-Claude Duvalier under Reagan. It happened before, it happened since, where you would get a phone call from the US Embassy saying you are leaving at 6 in the morning and the Haitian president say yes. The fact that the Haitian army was disbanded did not help matters because it becomes far more difficult to operate because you have to use an invasion, you have to use other means to get rid of presidents instead of telling the generals now it's time to take over and establish a junta. We're familiar with juntas.
Well, another
Yeah.
Another question from our audience, very particular one. Who is Ariel Henry and whose interests does he represent?
Well, he replaced Claude Joseph, who was the outgoing prime minister under Moise. In fact, the day of the assassination of the president, Ariel Henry was to become the prime minister. Now he is acting as the prime minister. There is no president in the country as we speak because the constitution had been amended. And so there was no clear way for the succession of the president. The prime minister would have stepped in as interim president if the National Assembly, that's the Chamber of Deputies in the Senate, would convene and name that person as interim president. I like the old system better. We have had 23 constitutions in Haiti, 23. And the old system was that the oldest Supreme Court justice would step in as interim president to organize elections in case of a vacancy. Well, Moise fired several Supreme Court justices, and this was no longer operational in terms of the succession because they had changed it. And so who knows? There will be another constitution, I'm certain, that will be the number 24, I believe, in this case. But the Haitian constitutions have always been very liberal constitutions and magnificent works in terms of the art form and the French and everything else. These were model constitutions that the world would be proud to have. But of course, they've been observed in the breach rather than in reality. But Ariel Henry is he is the prime minister and there is no president at the moment. And he's supposed to organize election, but the US won them immediately. And Haiti is not prepared to have elections right now. It's not possible. Plus we are having COVID and it's a major problem as we speak. I lost two very close friends to COVID recently in Haiti. And I'm sure others are dying, but we're not aware of the situation as it occurs there.
So what do you see going forward? I mean, is there any basis upon which to be optimistic, or is it likely more of the same in terms of interference from the outside?
I wish the US would leave Haiti alone. I wish that wish of his. And Biden said no, but the Pentagon said it's under study. We're studying that question. And the Haitians often need another occupation because it's resulted in nothing at all. And it's offensive to all of us in the country. Elections cannot be held the other way. The US always likes elections, which means nothing. You know, I ask my students to define democracy, they're unable to do so. And I asked them, when did the US become a democracy? It's 1776, which is reasonable. And we know what democracy brings. And this has nothing to, elections have nothing to do with democracy. There need to be structural changes that need to take place, and it only can come from the inside. There was a Haitian peasant woman who said in 1987, tell Mr. Schultz, that's the Secretary of State of the US, we want Haitian democracy. We do not want American democracy. Haiti is Haiti. It is not the US. We cannot have the same system. We're not the same people. We're very different.
Well, I wish we could end on a more upbeat note, but experience has perhaps suggested otherwise.
Yeah.
If there are no other questions from the audience, I guess it falls to me only to thank you, Patrick, for your insightful analysis as always, and to thank our hosts, the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and particularly thanks to our participants for taking time out on a sultry afternoon.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Doug.
And thank you for having me.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.